Hello, one and all, and welcome to a venturous version of Top Tech Thoughts. Now, contents here. This video is going to be a little bit live-ish kind of scenario, kind of like a live blog of talking about my top 10 cards of the new MTG D&D set, Adventures of the Forgotten Realms. The reason why it's kind of a little bit haberdash at this moment is mostly because we had a really short schedule, so to speak. Like, we got our last of the preview cards on Tuesday, to put it in perspective, and Arena is going to have the update come out on Thursday, which left me to actually get Wednesday to actually get this video out and actually talk about what is my top 10 cards from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. So, we're going to do that real quick. A few things to keep in mind. One, this is mostly personal opinion. There could be some cards that you might like better than I do. This is just my personal take on what I think are currently could be the best cards, or just maybe my favorite cards from the set. You're definitely going to see that with number one, I'll say that right off the bat. But first things first, let's actually get to a few of the honorary mentions. One honorary mention that I would feel remiss if we didn't talk about is, of course, I always like to mention it when I have the opportunity, thanks to Wizards of the Coast. They did offer me a preview card this time around. I actually cooperated with Children of Alar to actually make a really funny video on it. I might post a link in the captions down below. It was fun to be able to preview this card, and it was actually kind of nice to see the positive response to the video, as well as one person who makes a D&D cube said that they are actually going to consider this card for their cube, which is actually really, really nice to see. Besides that, mostly in the honorary mentions, I would put stuff. Mostly, I would say a majority of the classes are definitely an honorary mention. I think they're cards to keep an eye out. As well as the other honorary mention that's specifically a card is, let's see. That's the one little catch 22 when you do this kind of live. You kind of have to scroll through Scribe Fall, but let's see. It was right around. Here it is. Technically, I put this on my sleepers, but I did decide to sneak it a little bit into the honorary mentions, because I do think this card is actually legit really good. 3 mana free one for a flying that can't block. Perfectly fine. You're going to go aggro with this. But what's also really great with this card, that if it dies, you can either use it, you can either recast it for recursiveness, or you can actually card draw and maybe cast a better spell, and the fact that you have the ability to decide to do this until the end of your next turn, very, very nice. I do like this card a lot, and it did kind of sneak into my honorary mentions because it was originally a sleeper, but I decided to give it the honorary mention because I'm going to be honest, I could see this card sneaking into standard. This card is really good. Like, really, really good. Nevertheless, let's actually get to the list, which I have here. So let's get to number 10. So number 10, this one is kind of an easy pick. Like, a lot of people have already been talking about this card. Prosperous Innkeeper. 1 in a green for a halfling citizen. 1/1. When it enters the battlefield, create a treasure token. And it has an ability of Soul Sister, where whenever another creature enters the battlefield into your control, you gain 1 life. This one is pretty simple why this one is really good. It's just a 2 mana generate a treasure, which helps you ramp into bigger creatures. Like, I see the majority of Stompy decks have been very considerate of this card, like being able to play this on turn 2 and then turn 3 get like a 4-drop, or even wait to turn 4 to get a 5-drop with that gold that you get from the treasure token. Very... You can tell how I previously played in Pharaohs, since technically gold and treasure are kind of like the same functionality. Anyway, also, this is actually, I would make an argument, can also be good in a go wide deck, since due to the factor that you get generate a treasure token, you could use that to just get this 2-drop, and then use the treasure to automatically cast a 1-drop spell, for example, or 1-cost creature, which then you get the minimal life gain. And while the life gain synergy is not the most exciting aspect of the card, it is one that you at least have to keep an eye out on, especially if you make your deck have any life gain synergies whatsoever. But this one's a pretty safe bet that it's not my number 10 card. It's just a 2-drop that helps you ramp, which is really good. 2 drops or 2-cost spells that help you ramp is nothing you should underestimate. Granted, it's temporary ramp, but it's still ramp. So number 10, obviously, Prosperous Innkeeper. No sweateroni to the pepperoni about that one. Next up, number 9, we're actually going to go into the gold cards this time in one of the legendaries, which in this case, I kind of have to put this on there. Now, I'm going to be honest. I did not know much about D&D lore. Like, I do love that pretty much personalities within the Magic the Gathering scene, like Shivam, as well as a variety of other associates that I have, did kind of give me the clarification on some of the lore of the characters and such. And I'll be honest, I did not know about Minx and Boo. I'll be completely honest. But the more I learned about it, and the more that I pretty much Shivan had literally just a whole thread talking about the history of Minx and Boo and such, and it's kind of like that Office meme, you know, the one where it's like, I only had this cat for like about a few hours, and I would pretty much die for it essentially. That's kind of what I'm feeling about this card, because one, it's a card that makes a hamster token, which, by the way, the hamster token is adorable. Plus, I'm not even just joking about this card being on my list just because of the joke appeal of, oh, card that makes hamster token. I still think this is actually a pretty good card. Just a 3 mana free that generates a 1/1. Very nice. Especially that 1/1 has haste. Very nice. As well as Mints having the activated ability to essentially giant growth or even make really, really big any of your creatures. It can also buff itself, keep that in mind. So if you put this in a Naya deck that has ramp, like say one with Prosperous Innkeeper, for example, you can sometimes make your really, really small creatures, like in this case the hamster, or even some of your mid-range creatures, into pretty significant threats. So, plus, they also make them a giant, which we do have giant-based synergy cards within, thanks to Kaldheim and such, so that's another thing to keep in mind. I'm not gonna lie, I do actually like this card a lot. I could see some standard decks giving it a shot. Do I think it's going to be the most competitive option? No, but I do see a lot of people at least giving it a shot because, seriously, you make a giant space hamster. That's hilarious. So, number 9, Mink's Beloved Ranger, without a sweateroni to the pepperoni. So we get to number 8, and number 8, we go from kind of like silly, fun meme construction to more spiky cards, which I will admit, this is probably one of the more spikier cards on the list because, oh boy, it's really, really good. Undeath Dracolish. 4 mana for a 5/2 with flash and flying, and it enters the battlefield tapped. But it has flash, so obviously you're going to probably cast this on your opponent's turn, unless your opponent has a way to make you not cast this at flash speed, which there are a few cards in Magic do that. But the most important part is you may cast this card from your graveyard if a creature not named this died this turn. Okay, this card is absurd. A 4 mana 5/2 flash flyer. That is a really, really aggressive oriented stat line. Like, you can literally, if you don't have any flying blockers in your way, in a normal game of standard Magic, 4 hits and your opponent is dead unless they have any life gain synergies. So, yeah. Also, the factor is that this can be a recursive threat. So, essentially, you can just play kind of like a semi-controlled deck, for example, and even if it goes to the graveyard because you cast it on turn 4, later down the line, on turn 6, let's say you cast like a Heartless At on your opponent's turn, and then, flash this back in, you get your 5/2, and now your opponent has to deal with this. Like, with the exception of exile removal, which I do think that's the reason why this card is a little high on the list, is because we are still in a meta where exile removal is very, very popular. That's kind of what makes Undeath not, like, broken in standard at the moment. It is due to the factor that we do have a lot of exile removal. But I still do think this is a very powerful card to keep an eye on. I can see this seeing some competitive constructed play. Just a recursive threat like this is nothing to sneeze at, especially when you can just cast it during your opponent's turn and then just automatically swing in for 5. That is really, really good. Like, yeah, that is... If you told me that somebody was going to make a mono black aggro deck and have this as one of the top ends, I would not be surprised. So, yeah, I think it's safe to say number 8, Undeath Dracolish, without a sweat. Number 7, this one is kind of a tie, but I'm going to actually give it. It's essentially the Planeswalkers of the cycle, which the ones that I was talking about specifically was both the Azrael as well as Grandmaster Flowers. And the more I thought about it, I'm actually going to give the 7th spot to Grandmaster Flowers. Really. Okay, this card doesn't look amazing at first glance. I'm going to say that right off the bat. Like, a 4-mana free loyalty planeswalker that has both pluses, with one of them being, like, very conditional, your opponent can't attack, as long, well, pretty much a specific creature your opponent controls can't attack, as long as they don't have those keyword abilities, which, be careful with that, because I do think there's a lot of cards that have those abilities in Standard, so especially Vigilance, especially when somebody attaches a Mauled Skyclave, so keep that in mind is what I'm going to say there. But I will say I do like both abilities on this card. Just being able to freeze a creature, especially when we still have a majority of creatures in the meta that are still popular, like Goldspan and Dragon, that you can freeze with the +1 effect. Very nice. Also, the +1 effect to be able to search your card for a Monk of the Open Hand, which, for those who don't know, it's a 1-mana 1-drop that whenever you cast your second spell, you put a counter on it. That's just nice because that just gives you both a... Okay, that was my secondary headset there, so my bad there. Like I said, live everybody. Anyway, as stated before, I do actually like the Monk of the Open Hand ability on this card because it both allows you to essentially create a blocker if necessary, but if you can cast a second spell and do those abilities, that does become bigger and bigger later down the line in the game. But mostly I just like it because it's a blocker. Plus, also remember you can also search your graveyard. So if you have any like Lorehold graveyard synergies, like I'm thinking like the legendary kind of like elephant that anytime you return a card from your graveyard, you get like a spirit token, stuff like that. Then the card actually synergizes with that when you return the monks from the graveyard to your hand. So keep that in mind. Also, another thing that I think people are missing about this card, with the fact that you can get the monk tokens or the monk cards, they're cheap 1-mana spells, which, granted, yeah, they synergize mostly when you cast a second spell, but if you put this in a deck where you do have the cast second spell synergies, the monks can themselves be the second spell if you have other spells within your deck design and you want to have the second base synergy, which we have like a ton in Kaldheim and such. So, look at Kaldheim, anything that says whenever you cast your second spell, do it, then it synergizes well with Grandmaster Flowers. And the fact that it has the static effect, which is, I think it's a little bit of Christmas Landy, a teeny little bit, not too badly, but a little bit. But it's obvious to say that if you can get this to 7 loyalty, yeah, getting a 7/7 dragon creature with flying that's indestructible, very, very, very nice. Especially since it doesn't lose its loyalty when it becomes a creature, which is something to keep in mind. Especially if you like put this like in a bant list with like say the Kasmina, essentially, and then you could just use those loyalties to just do different things. Like let's say like you want to make sure you just only like Scribe 2 or still do her to his, I don't know, is Bahamut a he or a she? Or like I said, D&D lore not the best, but I'm going to say they for the sake of clarence there. Anyway, essentially then what happens there is essentially you use the +2 Scribe if you don't need to do any of the +1s. And when you add a loyalty where you can use it, you can then just minus X to just make a fractal token, which perfectly fine. Though, on the other side of the coin, you could also technically, since the factor it protects itself pretty frequently, and you go into the Kasmina archetype, you could technically just ultimate with Grandmaster Flowers and get a very powerful white instant sorcery spell, so that's something to keep in mind. Okay, you kind of see why I kind of put this on number 7. There's just a lot of like funny little opportunities of brewing around with this card that you can actually do. Plus, also, this is also a really good top end for aggro decks. Like, don't forget that +1, the first one, makes it that they can't attack or block. So if your opponent has a nifty blocker that is making your aggro deck not being able to go through, like let's say an Elder Gargaroth, for example, being able to use the well, the problem is you can't really do Elder Gargaroth since it has a Vigilance, so that doesn't work. But like any other creature besides Elder Gargaroth, I guess, that they're blocking with, just being able to make them not block and be able to swing in, very, very nice. So, number 7 is Grandmaster Flowers, mostly just because I like the unique design of this. I do like its applications in both aggro decks as well as janky brew decks, which, I mean, I jank brew, so yeah, I'm definitely going to test this card out a little bit. So, plus also the ability to shuffle your library, also get cards from your graveyard, does have little tiny synergies to keep in mind within your deck design. So, keep an eye on Grandmaster Flowers. I can see it being a pretty good card. Next up on the list is another card that we're going to stick to the white mythics, and I'm going to. This one is probably the second. We'll talk about the number 1 best mythic legendary dragon when we get down later in the list, but Icing Death Frost Island is probably the second best dragon of this whole cycle, in my personal opinion. Because here's the thing. A 4-mana 4/3 flyer with Vigilance, perfectly fine. Perfectly a great card, in my personal opinion. Just 4-mana, 4/3 flying Vigilance, that's a good aggressive threat. It allows you to be good aggressive threat, as well as a blocker. Very nice. And the fact that it has a death trigger, which gets you the legendary white equipment artifact token, which then allows you to give your creature a buff, as well as being able to tap a target creature defending player controls, which then allows you to essentially maybe be a lot more aggressive than you would usually, being able to tap down one of their big creatures. In this case, I can actually say the Elder Gargaroth this time, so being able to tap down the Elder Gargaroth and then just swing in with your team, that's really, really good. I could see this being a auto include or even a very good consideration in mono white aggro decks. It's just that good. Like a 4-mana 4/3 flyer, nothing to underestimate, especially since it has the recursive threat that it becomes an artifact. And even if you need to, it does have the ability. One of the weird, awkward things about legendary cards in general is the fact that if you have 2 copies in your hand, it's kind of awkward. However, there is the benefit that if you need to, you could just have your aggressive one that's already on the battlefield, and then if you have the mana to sink, you could just cast a secondary one, have it die, but then still get the artifact that you can equip to one of your creatures, even to Icing Death itself, and make it a 6 free with Flying and Vigilance, which, yeah, pretty good. I could see this in mono white aggro decks. I could also see this in equipment synergy decks. This card's just really, it's a really silly card. Like, very powerful. Don't underrate this card. It's going to see some play in standard, in my opinion. Next up, this one is now going more from the spike to more of the janky brew, but I could see an argument of this actually seeing competitive play to an extent, and we go back to the golden cards this time around. This time, it's actually kind of interesting, because I'm going to actually put a really weird one on the list, which is Cairn Reclusive Painter. 2 mana and Rakdos for a 1/2. When it enters the battlefield, create a treasure token. So, in itself, you're just getting, if you are in the Rakdos colors, you're getting Prosperous Innkeeper. We already talked about how good Prosperous Innkeeper is about helping to ramp you into 4 drops to 5 drops and such. So, in itself, that's great. But I do like the ability that this creature has, which is other creatures to control into the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on them for each mana from a treasure spent to cast them. So, this is actually really good, because the thing is, as we mentioned before, you are mostly going to use that treasure to ramp into a 4-drop or a 5-drop, essentially. That's kind of what you're going to use treasure primary for. There are times where you are going to use it as a semi-trick card in an extent to essentially, like, protect your spell with, like, a Dispel-like effect or Hexproof-like Ranger skill effect, essentially, so you got to keep that in mind. But if you are just ramping to your 4-drop or 5-drop, being able to get that 4 or 5-drop with an additional counter on it, very nice. Plus, this card's power level goes up higher the more treasure-based synergies you have within your deck design. Because, remember, one of the popular cards in the format is Goldspan Dragon. Goldspan Dragon generates a ton of treasures. We have a ton of popular cards that are coming into the meta as well, already in the meta, that are treasure generators in themselves. So this can provide a lot of counters on your creatures really, really quick. And worst case scenario, This is just another Prosperous Innkeeper, granted a legendary one, which, you know, you can't have a second copy on the battlefield. Though there is a cute synergy that actually, strictly better in Magic the Gathering, or as people know as Dev, actually pointed out on one of his streams when he was talking about this card. You can actually be cute with this card and just essentially cast a second copy with a treasure to actually make this a 2-freeze so it can get out of Bone Crusher range. So that's a thing to keep in mind. But yeah, I like this card a lot. I do think this does have a teeny little chance to actually see some standard play, especially in treasure-based synergy deck design. So keep an eye on this. Keep a very close eye on this. Besides that, let's see, what else was on the list? Okay, actually we're going to stick close to Rakdos colors in this time, because, Orcas, Prince of Undeath. Remember how I mentioned that a Rakdos midrange deck can be a thing? Here's a card you would put in your Rakdos midrange deck. I mean, first of all, if you don't even spin the Ets, it's a 4-mana, 5-flea, flying trample. That's aggressive. That's good aggressive stats. That's allow you to get some damage. Even in an aggro deck, this would be perfect. Like, 4-mana, 5-flea, flying trample, sign me up. That is perfectly good. And the fact that later down the game you have the Ets ability, that is very, 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 very nice. Like, just look at those abilities. Being able to make each other creature get negative Ets until in a turn. Granted, you have to lose life, but being able to have a Toxic Deluge-like, aka Language-like spell to help eliminate an opponent's board presence, that's really, really good. Especially since it, due to the fact that it's negative Ets, so it passes against indestructible creatures. That's very good. And then, if you're playing this in a low-curve aggro deck, having this as your top end is even good with the secondary ability, being able to return up to Ets target creature cards with total mana value of Ets or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, and then gain haste. That allows you to essentially have a Agadeem's Awakening that's a little bit better, because you get a 5-flea flying trample, as well as all those other creatures essentially just become a hasty, aggressive finisher. I kind of think of like that 4-cost like Boros spell, where essentially you get the 2 tokens, and then every creature token you have has essentially +1 in haste. That card is what reminds me of why this card is really, really good, because there's just sometimes where your opponent's like, you're going against a control deck, you play your aggressive threats, but then it gets removed. Oh, you top deck this, you put Ets like, let's say, for example, let's be realistic here. So, let's say you're at 5 mana. So, let's say, best case circumstances, you can get Ets 2 free. So, you can actually return up to free target creatures, which either can be just 1/1-drop or 2/2-drops, or just even free 1-drops, and then just get the essentially aggressive boost of them hasting and go wide. So, I like this card a lot. Like, I think this card, plus also one thing to keep in mind if you do a Rakdos Treasure Synergy deck, remember Cairn is in there, and remember, if you use treasures to spin into the Ets as well as D2, or even spin the cost, this is going to get additional +1/+1 counters. I'm just going to say, if there's a deck that's going to have Cairn, I could see the deck also having Orcas, Prince of Undeath. Let me put it like that. There's a reason why I put these really close. Let me just put it like that. But yeah, Orcas, Prince of Undeath, very good card. Don't sleep on it. It's going to do some shenanigans. Even maybe potentially some spiky shenanigans. Okay, let's see, what's next? Oh, yeah, we're going to have to talk about this card. Now, going from the realms of Standard to the realms of Modern, or Eternal formats, Treasure Vault. Okay, here's the thing where most people, how they analyze this card when they first initially seen it. They're like, okay, so it taps for generic mana. Okay. Okay, and then if we double our mana into this, we can create, like, Ets treasure tokens. Okay, why is this card good for Modern? And then you read the little teeny clause that says artifact land, and then every Modern player went, oh, yes. Now, Now, I don't think it's going to make much impact in Standard, though I would make an argument that it is kind of cute in the Treasure Synergy decks, if there's any that are in the meta and such. But this is going to be an Eternal Format staple card, or potentially an Eternal Format card, because Affinity is one of the popular deck types in Modern at the moment, and they do love their artifact lands. Here's another artifact land that can also make more treasures, which then you can actually get to the Ets essentially activation ability a lot easier, especially since we have a lot of creature-based cards or mana dork cards that essentially tap for like 2 color mana, but then you can only use it to activate abilities of artifacts. Hey, this is an artifact. You can literally there's a 2-drop that does this effect where you can tap it for 2 colorless mana, activate it. You can literally tap that and then tap Treasure Fall just to make 1 treasure. It's not the most exciting Fiend, but, when it gets better, when you have more of those mana dorks or have more other mana generators, such as artifact mana dorks or, mana rocks, then this gets pretty silly. Also, this is going to be a very, 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 very silly commander card. Yeah, you're going to have to pump a lot of mana into this, but there are some decks that are going to love that this is a Ets generate X amount of tokens at the right time. I'm very considerate of this card in my Rainbow Tokens list that I play, mostly because I look at this and be like, hey, with Academy Manufacturer, as well as making those treasure tokens, I'm also going to be making Ets food as well as Ets clues. Yeah, this is a card that I think in Eternal formats is going to be pretty silly. I'm not sure if it's going to be ban-worthy or anything, but it's going to make some dents in the format. Let me put it like that. So yeah, there's a reason why Treasure Vault is on the list. I think it's going to make some dents in the Eternal formats, if I'm being frank with y'all. Now, we get to number 2 on the list, which, I have to admit, I was not originally going to put this on the list, but, well, I think I would jokingly say, as I believe Hermit Druid said, I was initially analyzing this, I was like, I wonder if this is a good card. And then the collective cries of the CEDH community, and they're like, and then I say, oh, it's a good card. I did love that Twitter exchange. But for those who know what card made all the CEDH players lose their mind a few days ago, or technically a day ago since this is Wednesday, let's talk about Asmodeus the Archfiend. 6 mana for a legendary creature. It's a 6/6. And it has the activated ability of draw 7 cards for free black mana. That's really good, but you are restricted to the binding contract, which if you would draw a card, that's including the first card you draw during your turn, mind you. You exile the top card of your library face down. Instead, how do you get those cards back? Well, you can activate for 1 black mana to return all cards exiled with this card, the Archfiend, to their owner's hand, and you lose that much life. So if you essentially draw 7, you then spend the black mana to get all those cards you drawed, essentially exiled to your hand, and lose 7 life. That's the basic catch-22. So essentially, you can spend 4 mana to draw 7 cards and lose 7 life. Will you do that? A lot of competitive EDH players will say the following phrase: yes, absolutely. Plus, also another thing that the CEDH community actually kind of pointed out to me with this, which I was totally missed on my initial analysis of this. The reason why this is actually a pretty potentially good CEDH card is the factor that it is semi-exile draw due to the binding contract, which actually can help you against kind of the card draw hate cards in the meta, specifically stuff like Hole Breacher, stuff like that essentially. So being able to have this semi-impulsive draw essentially allows you to bypass that essentially, as well as essentially if you have any synergies to impulse draw, that's also really good. So keep that in mind. So being able to just do the, well, not even impulse draw, it's more exile draw. So have this draw pile that later down the line you can actually then just lose the life to draw those X cards. It's like a semi-worse Necropotence, but still Necropotence was a pretty silly card, so it's pretty silly. Also, another thing that I kind of missed by my total glance of this that actually makes this card silly and potentially a standard card. Remember, you can do interactions when this ability is activated, so you really don't want to do the Binding Contract, but you really want to draw those 7 cards, if you're at the point where you're casting this for 6 mana, next turn, if it doesn't die, you have your first little impulse draw, which then you lose 1 card, but then you activate it, draw 7 cards, but before the draw happens, you can, like, destroy this. Like, you can either use a Village Rites, like, heck, use a Village Rites on this when the activation's on the stack, and then that'll allow you to draw about 9 cards, which, in a lot of control decks, drawing 9 cards is absurd. Now, there is one little trap to this card that I think a lot of people need to remember when playing this card. Remember, if you have the cards initially exiled with a copy of Asmodeus that then dies later, you lose those cards for good. You can't recast the Asmodeus and then be able to draw the cards from the initial Binding Contract from the initial Asmodeus. No. Those cards are lost, so you have to restart your card draw engine over again. That weakness beside, that's the reason why it's not like the number 1 card on the list and such. It's still a really absurd card. Like, it's definitely going to be an Eternal Format card. I even remember Ali Golem when this card got initially spoiled, and their initial question was like, wait, is this card in Standard? And I had to make the response, yeah, this card is in Standard. And when somebody makes the statement of wondering if a card's been made for Standard, or at least essentially said, wait, this card's been printed, you know the card's good. So I definitely got to keep my eye on this for Standard, but obviously for Eternal formats like EDH and CEDH, they are adoring this card. Like, they really want to brew around it. So, yeah, Asmodeus, my number 2 card. Now, we go from probably one of the more spikiest to probably my number 1 card, which for many people who knew what card I really was hoping from the set, you can probably guess, even though I wouldn't say this is a competitive card per se, but I kind of still love it, and I might still just put it in decks. It's the deck of Many Fiends. Okay, let's get this out of the way. Do I think the deck of Many Fiends is a competitive card? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. However, do I think it's a fun card? This is a card that I'm probably going to at least put a 1 of in each of my decks just because I want to have just the fun potential of rolling and seeing what happens? Yes, because here's the thing. Let's look at all these at the Fiends. So, if you do get bad luck and then essentially get the 0 or 0 or less, discarding your hand, that's bad. That's the reason why this card is not good. Just let me put that out of the line, unless you have any Madness synergies, which, granted, we are going to Innistrad, so there might be some Madness synergy cards to keep in mind, potentially, if they bring Madness back, so you gotta keep that in mind. But, in general, if you do get the 0 due to the fact of rolling a d20 and then having to subtract your hand and it's 0 or less, losing your hand is really bad. That's kind of why I'm not going to say this card's great for Standard. I'm just going to say that. I'm going to play it in Standard because I like the card and I'm going to have fun with it, but I don't think it's going to be a like, if you told me that this card was going to see play in, like, the top 8 or something, I would be surprised. I'm just going to say that. I would be surprised. However, I do love all the activation abilities on this. First of all, 1 through 9, kind of like the average, what you're probably going to get. Return a card at random from your graveyard to your hand. For many people who know me, I do love my regrowth style spells, and the fact that this is kind of like a chaotic regrowth is actually kind of cool. So being able to return, like, even sometimes just returning like a Fable Passage or an Evolving Wilds to your hand, just so that you can have a land drop to play, perfectly fine. That's perfectly fine, especially if you need a land. But there are some times where you can actually have this to essentially return, like, maybe a very essential card to help you with the game and such. Granted, Magical Christmas Land, but I kind of love like it provides that interaction where maybe you return just the right card to your hand and have the puzzle of how to use that right card at the right moment. Like, I like that. It's the reason why I like regrowth. It's chaotic regrowth, don't get me wrong, but I do like that. And then 10 to 19, draw 2 cards. Will you spend 2 mana to draw 2 cards? Yes. Especially if it's consistent, which, if you put this in the right deck, might be consistent enough, so just 2 mana, draw 2 cards, perfectly fine. And then 20. Now, granted, as many people point out, you have to get hell-bent, or you have to have an empty hand to get to the 20. However, if you get to the 20, oh, you're going to have a good day. Being able to put a creature card from any graveyard onto the battlefield under your control, and then when that creature dies, its owner loses the game, you can literally, like, get your opponent's bomb, or even, like, maybe one of your opponent's, like, lesser creatures that you can maybe, like, have a village rights automatically sack it and make your opponent lose the game. That's just going to make, like, a fun kind of, like, oh, I can't believe this happened moment, which, for many people, this is going to be kind of like a stream card, I would say, because it's going to make those moments where you stream the 20 and you get the excitement, and then you have your little clip that you're going to put on Twitch. So that's also another angle to look at the card, I will say. It's definitely a Twitch/streamer bait card. I'm going to say that right off the bat. But I like this card. I like the design of it. I kind of like the chaotic regrowth as well as card draw. And I even kind of like the factor that you still have the risk of discarding your hand, as well as being 5 mana, is the reason why I don't think this is going to be competitively viable whatsoever. But I love that they designed this card. Let me be frank. This is going to be the card that I'm probably going to craft at least one mythic. Yes, I would not recommend crafting this for the record, but I'm going to craft it because I like the card. I'm going to love playing it, even though I know it's not a competitive card whatsoever. But I just love the flavor. I love the design. It's just a card that I will love to play, and that's why it's kind of my number one card, even though it's not like the best card from the set. Let me be frank. And that is my top 10 cards from the Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. What are your personal favorites? If you want to say any of your personal favorites, just leave it down in the comments below. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. I hope you all have a lovely day. This is LevDev, signing out. Bada beep, bada boop.